Okay, there we are. That's me aboard the HMS Endeavour replica many years ago. Uh, my business portfolio is operating a company called Gord Laco and Associates, which is a group that expands and contracts as needed. We outfit museum ships all over North America with rigging and weapons and procedures and so forth, and we do sometimes sail them. I am the Canadian distributor for Epifaunus yacht coatings from Holland, and I do historical consulting and technical advising to film and television projects. I also work on contract for RCN PA in Ottawa last few years, covering Orioles Great Lakes deployments, and there's another doing now. I think we have somebody not muted there. Advance, please.
I'm going through and I'm actually muting people right now.
Oh, thank you, Paul. And when you're done, if you advance, I'll continue.
Okay.
Unless you mute me. So the way I got into the film business was when I moved here to Midland, Ontario in 1989, I discovered a historic site, which was in the years following the War of 1812, the Royal Navy's Upper Great Lakes Dockyard. I ended up working there. I became executive officer of the HMS Tecumseh replica, that's the larger vessel on the right, and later the master or commanding officer of HMS B, the schooner gunboat on the left. I used to describe that site to visitors as the Cold War missile silo of its day. We just fought our war with the Americans, which I call our war for independence from them. And the war was over in 1815, but neither side trusted each other. So from 1817 on, we had the famous Rush-Bagot Agreement, which I believe was the first working arms limitation treaty in the world that eliminated or closely regulated the armament of warships on the Great Lakes. It was a way to try to keep the peace. But we didn't trust them and they didn't trust us. So we had Penetanguishene, near where I'm sitting right now, with 5 warships with their weapons in a warehouse, ready on a week's notice to go to war for 54 years. Americans did the same with the base at Presqu'île on Lake Erie. And I used to end that long speech with descriptions of how it's probably a testament to people's ability to get along that those warships originally eventually sank and rotted at their moorings rather than went down in blazes of glory in wartime again. I'll add also that HMS B and HMS Tecumseh are the only 2 historic replica warships in the world that operate outside the Royal Navy that have royal warrants to use HMS. We had great fun with B once, taking her down to the lower lakes on a city visiting tour. We had to contact Seaway Traffic Control at Sarnia, and when my radio operator said HMS, the Coast Guard radio operator took exception to that, and it turned out later we found he was an old retired chief petty officer, but he demanded to know who owned our boat. So at that point, I took the microphone from the radio op and said, Queen Elizabeth II in Right of Ontario, which is what it says on our ownership. And there was a long pause, and then he said, "Are you stopping in Sarnia?" I said, "Yes, we are." And I told him where and invited him aboard. So when he arrived, we had a file of Marines presenting arms for him, and I invited him down to my cabin for a glass of port and very formally showed him our warrant. And we had a new friend. But that sort of thing was good fun. Advance, please. So that's how I looked on the left when we were visiting ports, the fearsome Captain Laco. I used to also tell visitors that when they came aboard, there we are, that to be my age, with such a humble command, I would have had to really have peed in somebody's pickle juice, not to have advanced and to have ended off in such a quiet backwater. The picture on the right is how we looked when we were sailing at sea. There's no enclosed bridge on a sailing ship, and if it rained, we got wet, and if it was hot, we got hot. And I will comment, actually, my wife's profession is making historic clothing, and she built that uniform for me that I'm wearing in the picture on the left. That when I'm dressed like that, I was wearing 5 layers of wool, 1 layer of linen, and there was horsehair stiffening in the jacket. When it was hot out, that garment was protection from the heat. When it was cold, it was warmth. They knew what they were doing with those uniforms. I could close the double buttons on the front and it would be a warmer than my normal winter coat. That hat tended to stay on whatever the wind. And it was a pretty intelligent garment for the time. It was definitely protection for the body. If I was doing strenuous work, I would overheat, but if I was just standing wearing that coat, I would actually feel cool where my back and armpits were sweating. And that's how the garment was designed. You can't see in that picture, but the shoulders are cut in a particular way. So there's a big wad of wool and under each armpit that sticks out a bit in the back. And that literally is a wick and a radiator. Amazing. They knew what they were doing then. Next, please. So in those years, in the early 1980s and later towards the latter part, sorry, the early 1990s, the government of Ontario was cutting its budgets everywhere. And at a time when they were having difficulty funding schools and hospitals, historic sites were in tough times. So it occurred to me, being a bit of an entrepreneur, that if I put the remainder of my ad budget into marketing the site to film companies, I could generate my own advertising money by a quite legal money laundering system I set up with the government's support, and basically lift myself up with my own bootstraps and build a advertising budget. So we started having film companies coming and shoot at the site, and I found I had a bit of an aptitude for being the translator between the wild, wacky movie people and museum people for whom a good day is a day in which not much ever changes. And I was mostly a peacekeeper, but also translator. So when I went back into the private sector, I found I was doing movies and TV documentaries on a part-time basis. This photograph was me back in those days when we were shooting a film called The Crossing, starring Jeff Daniels. Our particular challenge on that one was that the California producers of the show didn't quite understand that in April in Ontario, it's spring. And our movie was supposed to take place on a very snowy Christmas Eve, 1775, during the night of the famous crossing of the Delaware. So when things finally started happening and we had our hundreds of extras ready to shoot our battle scenes, it was spring in Hamilton, Ontario, where the site was. So thinking swiftly, I contacted the city works department and had dump truck loads of leaves from the fall before delivered to our location and spread over the ground. Presto, there's the green grass gone. And we bought truckloads of white fiberglass insulation, which we distributed to look like snow. And that's what you see over my head there. You have to use a bit of ingenuity sometimes when you're making a historic film. And that was a couple of the many stories that came from that one. Next, please. So one day, I was back at my desk in the marine business where I had allowed or gotten permission from the owner of the company, which distributed normal yacht equipment, to start selling rope to sailing ships. I'd looked for some of my own when there we go, from for HMSB, and we started importing that. And one of my clients was a historic ship named Rose that operated in New England. She was a replica of a 24-gun frigate operating as a sail training ship. Her captain, Richard Bailey, was a brilliant, or still is, a brilliant ship manager. But there's somebody else on the line.
After a holiday weekend, there's always a flare up.
Always a flare up.
Could somebody please mute?
Okay, thank you. So Richard called me one day at work and told me he'd already FedExed rigging diagrams to me, and I needed to be ready to respond with a quote to replace all his running rigging fast. And I would probably get the drawings momentarily. I said, yes, I can certainly do that. I hung the phone up and I thought to myself, where the blazes is he getting $120,000? I know he can barely pay his phone bill most of the time. And I called him right back and said, who's doing a Patrick O'Brien film? He said, I didn't tell you that, but I eventually discovered that what was brewing was Master and Commander. I did sell them the rope, and they took me as well to be lead technical advisor, and that changed my life. Russell Crowe was a wonderful man to work for 2 years, and he brought me with him to the media scrums at various locations in London and Toronto and LA. And in other parts of the world, people published what I said about the film, but in Canada, the story was local boy makes good. So I was literally able to throw off my tie and become what my wife calls a free range chicken. Historical consulting became a pretty much full-time operation. And just because I know how crazy the film business is, I started my importing company outfitting museum ships, and that seems to have flourished as well. Next, please. So one thing that came of Master and Commander was the Royal Canadian Navy discovered me. And I was invited to speak at the Battle of the Atlantic dinner at HMCS York in 2005. And after I did my talk about the making of that film, Commander Davies, who was the XO then, Paul, I think you know him well, stood up and thanked me. And he said, thank you very much, Gordon, a very interesting talk. I had long hair then still. And he said, my wife's been talking to your wife, and I know two things. One is, I know how old you are, and I know you wished you joined the Naval Reserve when you were in university when you should have. He said, I'm here to tell you tonight, you're not quite too old at age 50. And if you'd care to go for a commission, we'll support it. On the way home that night, Caroline and I talked, and the upshot of that was a year later, I found myself at HMCS Venture with a bunch of 20-year-olds doing 1 million push-ups a day. And but I survived, and I met Paul, and I very much enjoyed my 11 years in uniform. Next, please. So the movies continued through those years. The top left photo is myself at CFB Shiloh with a Royal Canadian Light Horse Artillery Sergeant who was just back from Afghanistan, doing a film documentary about comparing the effects of American Civil War artillery with modern artillery. So in the Q&A, if you folks want to ask me which gun hit the target bullseye like a laser 5 times out of 5, and which never hit it once at 1,200 meters, was it the 1861 Parrott rifle or the modern light gun, the modern 105? You can guess which one it was, and it surprised everybody. The sergeant told me they weren't used to shooting at things they could see. Normally they fired over the horizon. The middle photo of that very disgusted looking fellow was one of a series of documentaries I did about the Great War. We made expeditions to World War I battlefield sites, searching for lost soldiers. And in the course of those expeditions, we found a number of them. We were only able to identify one. But when we came back to Canada, we recreated what we surmised were the last hours of the soldiers we'd found. And that fellow there is actually a sailor from HMCS York. I preyed on my fellow members, hiring them after hours to be extras because forces people were wonderful. You say, form up here, bang, they do it. They know how to handle weapons like they mean it. And this fellow here had been wading in mud doing night trench attack scenes for about 8 hours when I took that picture. His expression was just perfect for a soldier of the Great War, and that actually became the poster for the series. In the picture on the top right, we do have fun doing these things sometimes. We're doing a low budget production about the Battle of Culloden, in which everybody had to dress up in uniform to thicken the numbers because they couldn't afford actors. And I don't know if you can see in the lower right of that picture, you can see a fellow with his wrist on a kilt. That's my friend Scotty, who was giving me heck about how long flowing hair, a linen shirt, and a kilt is makes a man a chick magnet. And I commented saying I thought my red infantry uniform made me more attractive to women. And he argued with me about that. So I responded by saying, Scotty, whenever you say go, I'll bet you a beer within 5 minutes I can have a pretty girl I've never met on my knee with my arm around her. He said, oh, you're nuts, go. Well, what he didn't know was that over his shoulder, I could see 2 tour buses unloading full of tourists. They were all Japanese students. So I stood up and I yelled, photo right here, and slapped my knee. And I had 4 girls. So you can see that dejected limp wrist on the knee there. He was defeated, and I was more attractive to women somehow. Next picture. So the productions came and went. Hi, Jerry. Jerry Pash.
Hey.
The productions came and went over the years. The marine business flourished. It seemed I always had a documentary or a film or a TV show brewing, in production and ending, but it was always steady. I have an agent, and I flog him to try to look ahead and see what's coming, and I work very hard myself. But a bit of an unsettling thing about this occupation is I literally never know what my next big production will be. They're always a surprise, always something I've never heard of. So in October of 2017, my wife was out of town. Actually, she was in Victoria visiting her mom and her sister. I was home alone watching a war movie that she wouldn't like, fell asleep in front of the TV with the pizza on the coffee table, woke up after midnight thinking, oh God, I fell asleep. I better climb upstairs to bed. Looked at my iPhone, and there was a text that had come in 45 minutes earlier from a Los Angeles number saying, Gord, call me now. So I phoned the number, and next, please. I phoned the, I think we need to go back one. No, okay, we'll stay there. I phoned the number, and it turned out, we can stay there. It turned out it was David Coatsworth, a producer I'd worked with on 2 other productions, including The Crossing and a TV series called American Gods. And he was working for Tom Hanks on a production called Greyhound, which was an adaptation of The Good Shepherd. So literally about 15 seconds after making the call, I was working on The Good Shepherd. Can you hear me over that voice? Yeah, okay. So I think probably since we're all related to naval issues, we know the story. The Good Shepherd was written by Forster shortly after the war. It's loosely based on the career of a real British officer. And Hanks told me once we were working together that he wanted to do another film where he could star as a commander in the World War II era. But he's my age, in his 60s, he's too old. So then somebody gave him a copy of The Good Shepherd. And I think, Paul, you've got a copy of that first edition too, as I do. Tom saw on the cover is the captain, and he's got gray hair. And the story is about a man who's too old. That's really what it's all about. So that's, he began working to convert that novel into a script. And I was brought aboard the production to be the naval consultant. Next, please. So that is Captain Johnny Walker. Johnny was his nickname. Most of you may have heard of him, but for those who haven't, I'll just describe very briefly. He was a Royal Navy officer who served in the Great War. He was axed during the very hard years between the wars. And when World War II came along in 1939, he was basically in the trash heap and not thinking his career was going to go anywhere. But he got called up because of the war emergency, which is basically exactly what happens in the novel Greyhound. And he became the greatest submarine hunter that history has ever known. But he deserves a movie of his own. But Greyhound basically is a paraphrased story inspired by that great man's career. Tragically, he worked himself to death and died before the war ended. So I don't believe he lived to see peace. But he was a great leader, a very effective man. And many of the anti-submarine techniques that he pioneered are still used today. Next, please. I gave you that picture out of order. That is David Coatsworth on the right. And on the left is a photograph of the Viking ship we built for his series American Gods. And there's a whole series of stories I can talk about that, but that'll be a different talk. Next, please. So I found myself in just before Christmas, 2.5 years ago, in Los Angeles. And as happens in the film business, I guess the Navy's the same way. It's not that huge a world and you run into people again. I was sharing an office with Doug Coleman, who I last met 18 years ago on the set of Master and Commander, where he was also the stunt coordinator. And we laughed at each other saying, God, Gord, and I said, God, Doug, we look like each other's father. Neither of us had white hair back then. But he's a good man to work with, and we all pitched in together. Next, please. So I've put this slide in here because it's something that Peter Weir said when we were shooting Master and Commander that struck me, and I've never forgotten it. He said in one of his interviews that when you pick up a good book to turn it into a screenplay, all the words fall out. And what he meant was that you lose all the description, you lose the 3 pages of describing what someone's thinking, and you have to find other ways of getting the audience into the actor's mind. So where, for example, in Master and Commander, we might have Jock Aubrey worrying about his troubles at home and worrying about his prospects of promotion and worrying about what he should do next and worrying about his friend Stephen Maturin. Well, the author could take pages to describe that and describe what he looked like and what he felt like and how wet and cold he was and so forth. In a film, we have to do that with shadings of color, with music, with very few words. And it's not so easy. You've got to put those words back in that fell out when you picked up the book. So my job on the production, besides being technical advisor on naval issues and military issues, was helping our director put the words back in between the lines so the audience would understand what was happening with very slight hints. I'll talk about that in the next few minutes. Next, please. So I landed at my desk, and the first thing we did was be presented with scripts, and that is my script there. And I remember the first time I worked on a big movie and showed my mother a Hollywood script with my name watermarked on it. She said, "Oh, Gordon, how wonderful." And I said, "Well, Mom, actually, that's not an honor. That's so they know who to skin if this ever gets out." So it's a bit of a brand as more than anything else. But what I did was go through it, working with the director and with Mr. Hanks in his offices in Los Angeles, adjusting the dialogue and the action to make things more realistic and workable. I sent for and had brought to my desk deck layouts of the vessels so we could figure out what the geography was that our actors were playing in and to guide the set deck department, which was building sets for us. And I brought to the set that circular protractor, which I've got in my hand here, actually. Remember that thing. I'll talk about it at the end. Next, please. So one of the first jobs I had to do was try to help the animators understand what's happening whenever a ship movements are described. So what I did was order up several pads of plotting sheets, such as I used to use when I was a ship's captain. And I think, I believe the sea officers still use today, in order to draw on these 54 sheets I ended up drawing what's happening every time in the script and in the novel something's going on. So you'll see here on the upper left, it says number 2, Dickie and Victor detach to investigate contact. Well, that's the action in this scene. Captain Krause adjusts dispositions of Keeling and Dodge. So I had to draw the convoy on course, describing speeds, so that we can look and see, say, if our point of view is aboard USS Keeling, the destroyer in the middle there in black, and the camera is looking from starboard to port, what does he see beyond him? Well, he'll see a Tribal class destroyer and a Lightning class Polish destroyer going from 12 knots up to 36, running down a contact. And if they look backwards, they'll see the convoy. And because 100% of the picture is animated using computer graphics, very sophisticated programs, you've got to know what the camera sees if the viewpoint changes, because it's all in the cyber world and nothing can be taken for granted. Everything has to be drawn in. In the upper right, you can see I've written there in pencil, script page 3, describing the action again, giving courses, and ebook page 11. We had an electronic copy of the original novel, so I could reference the animators to page 11 so they could see the longer description from the original author, what he was describing was happening in that instant. Interesting, nerve-wracking. Next, please. So what's happening when a destroyer is hunting a submarine? And I described for the production that, yes, there is a high-speed run-in, but they have to slow down so that their ASDIC and passive listening hydrophones can work. So I made pages and pages of drawings like this just so I could understand what was happening. And the red dotted line is the presumed movements of the invisible submarine. The pencil line is showing the destroyer each time the author in the novel described what the actors were doing. And if you correspond the letters in the two positions, you can see the two ships. It looks messy, but it's visualizing like this on plotting sheets was the only way to graphically make literally a cartoon of what was happening so that we could show the animators what was going on. Now, they can't see the dived submarine, of course, but they need to know where it is because that dictates what the ship is doing. Interesting? Oh, yes. Next, please. So from those scribbles that I made, and there were pages and pages of those, maybe hundreds, I would then kneel beside the animators. And here I took this picture looking over one of the animators' shoulders, and they put those ship movements into the cyber world. And we could adjust the speed of the ship movements so we could see how things were flowing and developing. And that way we could tell whatever the viewpoint was of the ship USS Keeling, which is the top vessel in the animation there, we could tell what she was doing and what could be seen from her, whatever direction we were looking in. It also allowed us to have in the cyber world a ship like the Despotiko, which is one of the vessels that sunk later. She's a freighter. Well, if we glimpse her early in the movie and we see her later, well, we need to know how many hours or days later it is in movie time so we can put her in the right place so she doesn't lurch and jump. And when you've got 37 merchant ships, 4 warships, up to 2 aircraft, and up to 7 submarines, you've got to keep track of what they're all doing in the cyber world. And you have to tell the computer what to make those ships do. So, for example, I chose 8 knots for the speed of this convoy, being an average for a slightly faster convoy. I had our escorts doing 10 to 12 knots, zigzagging around them. We had long discussions about how submarines work and how fast a submarine could go. If you slow a submarine down to 2.5 or 3.5 or 4 knots, like they do when they're trying to be quiet, it takes forever for them to approach their targets. Well, that's realistic. The director would say to me, but Gordon, it said here in your report in the Type 7C U-boat, they could do 9 underwater. I'd say patiently, yes, they could do 9 for an hour or 2 before they depleted their batteries. And they'd also be making enough noise with over-revving propellers that they would be giving away their position and effectively committing suicide. And I'd always say, we mustn't forget these men want to live, to go home again. We must give them actions that show that they're fighting for their lives, not throwing their lives away. And I'll talk more about that later. Next, please. So we worked on the pre-production, developing all those animations right up to Christmas Eve. And just like in funny movies, I literally caught the last plane home to Toronto and landed on my family's doorstep on Christmas Eve, very late at night. We didn't get a tree that year for ourselves, but they got me back, and that was a wonderful thing. We all reconvened again in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where there was a wonderful film studio, which had been used to make a science fiction movie before us, but it had all the facilities we needed on sets, in sound stages. Then we also had the historic ship USS Kidd, which was preserved in the town of Baton Rouge in her World War II configuration. She's a Fletcher-class destroyer. Yeah, she's late war, whereas our story is set in 1942, so her anti-aircraft armament is way too heavy. And a number of other issues, but we hope the audience would overlook that and observe the action more. We shot some of the action aboard the real ship, and a lot of it on sets we built in the studio. And I did have a chair with my name on it. Isn't that wonderful? They let me keep that back, which I gave to my father. I didn't get to sit in that chair much because I was usually up standing behind the cameraman or the director ready for questions. I'm wearing a headset on my ears so I can hear what the microphone is hearing, so I can answer dialogue if there's a question coming suddenly. And that white square in my chest is my studio pass with a special little star on it, which allowed me to get to places normal people, as we put it, weren't allowed. All that black equipment behind me is the hardware that ran the cyber world that our fake ships were in. And I'll talk a bit more about that later, but that was run by a fellow named Chad from Los Angeles, who I worked very closely together. I devised for him the ship's movements. He made them happen in the cyber world. And he had a tablet that he could hold that was spatially connected by a very sophisticated miniature GPS set to his hardware. So we could stand up on the set on the bridge. I'll have a picture later of us doing that. And he could hold the tablet up, and the tablet sees into the cyber world around us that's invisible to humans. So if we want to see what Tom Hanks sees when he looks over the bow, we hold the tablet up and we can see what the computer world sees over there. And sure enough, there's a destroyer on the horizon and a Canso circling, banking hard to starboard and so forth, and a rain shower. Well, we can't see that on the set. All we see is blue screens around us. So Chad and I worked very closely together doing that. Next, please. So sometimes while you're making a movie, despite all the planning, things change. So what we see here on the right is the director's hand and his scribbles with the bridge of the destroyer up in the top right in ink on his piece of paper, describing how he thinks he wants to shoot the scene of engaging the U-boat that we blow to the surface, which I loosely based on a Assiniboines fight with U-210. So we would take that, which is at time trace in the movie 57.25.30 on my pad on the side. Greyhound sinks the submarine. While I start drawing like that, so Chad can make the cyber world fit, where we've got the U-boat, which has made a U-turn, the Dickie, the code name for our fictitious HMCS Dodge, is damaged and swinging away to clear the field of fire for Greyhound to fire her main armament. It looks simple there, but that's the first of about 30 pages I had to write of that, almost like the way a kid would make an animation himself where you flip the pages. So we could then put that into the cyber world and make those ships do those things. And things would happen, like we find out, well, if the U-boat Gord is doing 15 knots and Dickie's doing her best trundling along at 16, which is the best a Corvette could do in flat water, the U-boat's not passing it fast, is passing it too fast. So we have to change the ship's speeds, and all that has to be worked out. Next, please. So here we see the action developing again, more trying to match what the vessels are doing with what's happening on board. Oh, and this is actually earlier in the film. Those of you who've seen the film will realize there's a moment where in the first submarine hunt, which actually in the original script was the third, the first two were failures, but that was edited out. We wanted to show Hanks's character learning his lessons as he's learning how to hunt submarines. And he knows the Type 7 U-boat can, by hard lessons, he's learned it can outturn him underwater at slow speed. And it's starting a turn to the left, and we have the sonar operator describing that. They wanted something, they wanted some cataclysmic thing for Krause to do, Krause is Hanks's character, that demonstrated he's learning his lessons. So what I came up with was he turns the other way and speeds up. So instead of trying to follow the submarine and failing again, he goes the other way and meets her in the circle, coming around head on. And I noticed when we were rereading the book, which of course I'd read before, and when I was going through the script, there was no mention whatsoever in the novel, nor in the script subsequently, of passive hydrophone listening, which of course is the big thing in submarine hunting. I surmised, I told Mr. Hanks, that because the novel was written so soon after the war, Forrester did not want to give the whole game away. They don't mention hedgehog, they don't mention homing torpedoes, they don't mention anything about hydrophone. It's just out of the picture. So I proposed that we insert passive listening back in the script, because in effect, by doing that, I could present the director with a narrator. The hydrophone operator can describe what's happening underwater, so the audience also knows what the submarine's doing. And so we worked all that in, and that's where we had that scene where the U-boat comes around his circle, the destroyer comes around his, going the other way. They realize, they lose him for a while, now they're coming in bow to bow, and the submarine realizes he's been outmaneuvered, panics, goes to full speed to try to minimize the length of time he's beneath the destroyer. They hear those over-revving screws. The hydrophone operator jumps into the bridge. He's trying to slip under us, and then we get our first submarine. So that's how all that developed. Actually, after the long and detailed planning session, it was in response to a challenge I got from the production to show somehow that Krause is learning his lessons on how to hunt submarines. Interesting, frantically tense sometimes. Next, please. So in the midst of all this, the United States Navy sent a captain from their public affairs office in Los Angeles with a binder full of complaints about the script. And his name was Russ. I won't say his whole name because I'm about to tell a funny story about him. But I quickly learned, knew absolutely nothing about the history of his Navy, let alone our Navy. He didn't even know that the RCN was involved in the Battle of the Atlantic. And his main beef was the moments of indecision and doubt that is a critical part of the portrayal of the captain in our story. It's all about Hanks, who really doesn't belong at sea because he's too old and he's completely inexperienced, somehow has to be the leader by virtue of accident of his rank over the Canadian, the British, and the Polish captains who've been fighting the Germans for 3 years and are damn good at it. Somehow he's got to lead them. They know more about it than he does. He learns his lessons the hard way, and men die when he makes mistakes, and that's grinding him down. Well, my captain from the USN did not like that. They gave him to me to keep out of the way. So I did my best as a ex-public affairs officer to keep his attention and out of people's hair. I took him to dinner that night in Baton Rouge, and we're sitting over the table, and he made a short speech to me, the thesis of which was, Gordon, as head of the United States Navy's Public Affairs Department, the most important part of my job is that we always present the United States Navy to the American public and the world as an undefeatable and decisive service. And when he said that, I said to him, well, Russ, I was just a lieutenant when I was in service, but I was a reservist and I'm a civilian now, so I've lost whatever fear of rank I had. I said, well, Russ, you should crack a book, mate. In the winter of 1942, the United States was completely indecisive, and I would say incompetent. They had everything to learn. And his jaw dropped when I said that. And then I leaned forward, and please excuse my language, but most of us, I think, here are either in the Navy or close to it. I said, Russ, does it not honor your service more deeply if we show people that it wasn't freaking easy? It was not easy. Why do we have to always make the enemies look like fools? And he just looked at me and he said, I never thought of it that way. And we got along fine after that, and he went home, and the production patted me on the head and said, glad we have you aboard. Next, please. So I just said earlier that all our sea scenes and so forth are animated. I will say it's extremely difficult, even in this day and age, to animate the ocean realistically. And I wrote essays to the production about how wave trains and wakes look, and how bow waves work, and at various speeds, how many waves there should be along the length of a ship. And there are formulas to calculate that everybody who knows anything about vessels knows. But Hanks was very concerned that the movie be realistic. So I picked up the phone and called some colleagues in Ottawa, and I got a frigate. And the good part about that story is, when I was a lieutenant in the Royal Canadian Navy, public affairs officer of HMCS York, I could not phone Ottawa and ask for a frigate and get one. But as the technical advisor for a Tom Hanks World War II movie, I did. Fortunately for us, HMCS Montreal was just about to start her workups, and with enormous generosity, the RCN Public Affairs Department and Maritime Command in the Atlantic made it possible for us to put literally a truckload of camera equipment and men and women aboard her to go to sea for 2 weeks for the workups. The North Atlantic in January of 2018 performed perfectly. We were all afraid that it was going to be like a mill pond. It was not. When Greg, the special effects supervisor, came back, I said, well, how was it? He said, I've been aboard other navies, including our own, which he's referring to his own US Navy. He said, you guys don't act like puppets on board. You act like you're a bunch of people doing a job together. He told me there's no question aboard Montreal of who was in charge and what the chain of command was. But he said there was no saluting like martinets. Nobody looked afraid of the people above them. There was what he called a can-do attitude. And I laughed and said, Greg, that's exactly what we strive for. I was so proud of those men and women aboard Montreal. Greg told me that they did everything for them except make an oil slick and light it on fire, which they asked for, but of course they couldn't do that. What they did was shoot the ship from the helicopter and from drones they brought, and this is one of the shots, I believe, of her at various speeds. So in the movie, every time you see a wake or a bow wave or a ship at high speed turning and so forth, that's really Montreal's wake that we've dropped our fictitious ships into. When you see tracers firing at night, those are her 50 caliber guns firing, which we were able to record. The production was so grateful for what the RCN did. They tried to pay for the service, but of course we can't take pay for it because we're the Navy. So what the production did was, in my 25-year-long career in the film business, utterly unprecedented. They found another way to pay. And what they did was make a donation of a colossal amount of money in the name of HMS Montreal to the Children's Hospital in the city of Montreal. They didn't have to do that, but that's a measure of Mr. Hanks and David Coatsworth's generosity. Those are people of quality. And they did that in order to thank Canada and our Navy for making those scenes possible. Next, please. Oh, did I get to go? No, I was working back in the studio working on scenes. So I was able to describe for the production how important what the US Navy calls the Combat Information Center in a warship is. It's in the novel. It's what we call the ops room. But again, it gives us a pictorial way to describe for the audience what's going on. It's perfect. So we manned our ops room, and we fid sometimes with how things were marked, but we were able to show the young men tracking and plotting the various actions going on around the ship, as would really be done if the ship were in action. So on the right here, on the left rather, you see one of the two plotting tables. And this is early in the picture where the destroyer is charging ahead of the convoy at 36 knots. You can see in the top of the picture the series of dots as the radar sweeps are catching the submarine, and things develop from there. On the right, there are grease pencil boards all around in the room that need to be worked at properly. So part of my job was to keep those up to date with what was happening in the film. So if some fanatic was freeze framing the movie, they could see that and I'd be able to defend myself. So what I've written here is IFF, that's identification friend or foe codes, none. We're not expecting to see aircraft, so there are none in mid-Atlantic. FL axis A, that's the course of the zigzag plan, number 4. Guide, I didn't know what that meant, so I just wrote none. For FL center, I didn't know what that meant either, so I just wrote my name on it. And down below, we have all the ships that are moving and being plotted, and those are real ranges and bearings for them. And we actually found the operation of the Combat Information Center very useful in keeping track of what was going on in the cyber world we couldn't really see. Next, please. So that's me working on that table. The actor beside me is Stephen Graham, who you may have seen as Al Capone in another movie. He was also in Band of Brothers earlier. That guy was a consummate professional, but of course he wasn't a sailor. So part of my job, as I'm doing in this photograph, is showing him how to use parallel rulers and how to plot an intercepting course. As things transpired, he was looking pretty careful doing it. So the director told me to put a dark shirt on. And in the movie, those are my hands that you see calculating the interceptions and plotting positions. And then they draw back to the actors. The young man on the left is a real veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces. Part of Hank's commitment to looking after those people was hiring them. That fellow had dreadful experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I got to know some of them very well, and they had quite crushing stories to share once they started talking. But they look like military people because they were. And my hat's off to them for what they endured, and how they're putting their lives back together now. Next, please. So here's a shot from up on the bridge of the destroyer while we're shooting. That's Tom Hanks in the white T-shirt about to get back into his uniform. In the picture on the left, that's me wearing a green shirt standing nearby. There's Chad with his tablet, which is literally a window into the invisible computer world that's around us. So we're inside a hangar, basically, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on a fake destroyer set made of cardboard and plywood. But if you look through into the cyber world, there's a stormy North Atlantic Ocean all around us. So we used that to to keep track of what was going, so we could tell the actors which direction to look and at what angles and so forth. Next, please. So onwards, the project proceeded. My tasks were naval gunnery, elevation, and bearing. We were so careful about making sure that if a target is at 11,500 yards, the 5-inch 38 caliber US naval artillery pieces were at the right elevation, pointing on the right azimuth. Of course, the movie got into editing afterwards and everything was wrong, but we did our best in the first place. How long does the shell fly when it's fired at this range? Well, we tried to work all that out, but it didn't make it through editing. We had to keep track of the performance of various types of vessels and bend them as we could to make it work in the picture. Performance of weapons I just described about. I never managed to convince the special effects people the difference between a star shell and a flare. I tried to tell them a star shell is a weapon. It's a way to light up the enemy. It's an unfriendly thing to do to somebody. A flare says, "Here I am, come and get me." But in every time we show a flare in the movie, it's a star shell and vice versa. But anyway, I did my best on that. We talked about how submarines operate. At one point, in the crossing scene early in the picture, with the submarines underneath, one of the producers asked me, "How far beneath us is this U-boat?" And I thought to myself, well, it knows it's known for a while it's being hunted. So I said somewhere between 400 and 600 feet. 400 and 600 feet. Well, how do they know where they're going? Well, they thought submarines cruised around with the periscopes up all the time. Well, no, when you dive, you want to hide, and these guys don't want to be found because they want to live to go home. So I started describing dead reckoning, time, speed, distance calculating, and I could see people's eyes glazing over. They really didn't want to hear about that, but it was a constant, I won't say battle because they wanted to learn, but constant refreshing of knowledge of how important it is to describe things to people that they hadn't thought of before. We talked about the capabilities of radar and sonar, naval sighting and reporting procedures, and of course, at the bottom, I've got in this scene, where should people be looking if there's supposed to be a burning tanker in a particular direction? Next, please. So that's the ship that we use, the museum ship. We're near the end, by the way, folks, so don't despair. USS Kidd fought in the Pacific War. She's a static display with a museum beside her in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I'd never seen levees before I worked there. When we started on location in the Canadian winter, the Mississippi River was low and she was high and dry in her cradle. And what looks like grandstand steps off to the left in that left picture is actually the levee itself. And the river is down where the puddles are. By the time we were finished principal photography 4 months later, the river was coming up, the ship was afloat, and it actually reached the top step before we all came home. And downtown Baton Rouge is actually about 60 feet below the level of the river when the river is in flood, because the silt is constantly lifting the floor of the river. So they have to keep building the levees higher and higher to contain it. And yes, they do dredge continuously. It's a pretty interesting state of affairs. The apartment that I was living in down there had a map on the back of the door showing where high water was when the flood comes. It never happened while I was there. Next, please. So we got to do some things for real ships. The good people at HMCS Sackville were contacted by our special effects department. And I have to admit that I committed a terrible gaffe with relation to the good people at Sackville. I was able to keep her winter North Atlantic camouflage. I was able to keep her barber pole on her funnel. But because one of the most, evocative things I worked on while I was in uniform was participate in the last search for, or the most recent search for, and commemoration of the loss of HMCS Shawinigan, I gave our HMCS Dodge Shawinigan's pennant number. I did not know that somebody earlier on had promised Sackville that she would bear her number in the picture. I've apologized profusely to them, and I'll do it again when I get to travel to Halifax to see them. But Sackville, I'm sorry, I didn't know, but I hope you'll understand that I was honoring our dead forebears aboard Shawinigan when I gave her K136. That's why I did that. We also shot lidar scans of Haida. A lidar scan is a way of creating a three-dimensional virtual image of a ship. We thought we would have a Canadian treble class destroyer in the story, but she became the British HMS James, and she's also HMS Diamond at the end. And oh, what discussions I had with the production about explaining how Haida had been defanged for the Korean War with her 4-inch guns, and we did give her back 4.7s for the picture. We changed her radar antenna array and so forth, and did our best to make her look like a wartime Haida. They were both ships were incredibly cooperative, as were the Bliskowicza people in Gdansk in Poland, who let us lidar scan her too. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Next, please. So that's Tom on the set. He's a very personable man. He loves history. He treats everybody with enormous respect. And I have to say, I really enjoyed getting to know him and working with him for 2.5 years. Next, please. So part of the filming was done in a virtual reality theater. This looks like a gymnasium with strange frames going around, and the actors all put stretchy suits on with colored ping pong balls on the elbows and wrists and knees. And this was also a place where if you looked into the computer, you saw that room was filled with the bridge structure of a Fletcher-class destroyer, as shown by the colored tapes on the floor. And we shot actors moving in those spaces so that the animations would appear more lifelike when we clothed them in flesh and clothing. That was a very remarkable experience. Next, please. So here's one of my a bit of my work from the year and a half of post-production work we did on the film. I would watch a review copy of the movie, and then go through it, marking time trace, which is the column on the left, my comments and descriptions. And I created for myself, as I've done in other films, a rating schedule for errors, A being very damaging, B less damaging, and C not so damaging. And you see I've got some A's there. And some things we were able to fix, and other things just became ingrained in the film. It's amazing what momentum sometimes things have in stories. We did our best though, and there we are. I'll leave that for a second if people want to read it. Paul, I'll put the onus on you to say go. Oh, there we go. So another, we did a year of post-production. We planned to release the film in conjunction with the US Navy and the Royal Canadian Navy with the anniversary of the Battle of the Atlantic celebrations and commemorations. And then COVID hit just before we were about to release the film. So everything was put on ice in consternation. The upshot of that was that the film was sold lock, stock, and barrel to Apple TV Plus, and my work was then transferred. They sold me with the film, so I joined Apple then to join the marketing. Next, please. So I showed you the circular protractor at the beginning, and good news, folks, this is the last picture. That device belonged to HMCS Assiniboine during World War II. And I don't know if you can see me in the corner. I'm holding it in my hand here right now, and that's it on my desk at the film. I had the great honor and pleasure when we moved here to Midland, Ontario, to meet William Lanose, known as Bill. Bill served his whole life in the Royal Canadian Navy from the earlier war years until the amalgamation of the services in the mid-60s. He served aboard Assiniboine in some of her most famous actions, and I learned a lot from Bill. That's a picture of him when he was a young subby. I knew him as a very gentle old man. He told me one time that I should never romanticize the Navy, and I said, of course, yes, Bill, I understand I never will. But of course, I always have. He never lived to see me in uniform. He died in 1993. But one of the things he left me was this circular protractor when he passed away. And this was used aboard Assiniboine in the famous action against U-210. And when that was over, Bill realized he'd witnessed history, and he put it in his pocket, and he kept it to remember that terrible day. And he gave it to me. And I brought it to Baton Rouge with me, and I handed it to Tom Hanks. And as I've done with other actors, I I told him I wanted to bring an artifact from the time that he could hold in his hand and think about the people, the real people that he was commemorating in the picture. And I didn't have to do much work to help Mr. Hanks do that. He's got enormous reverence for history and for the people. And he made sure that this protractor is on the chart table on the bridge every time you see the chart table in the picture. I showed him this picture of Bill. I told him Bill's story. And I also told him something Bill told me at the very end of his life. He'd never talked much about the war in the years I knew him and I worked with him. He's actually the man who qualified me for command of HMSB at the site. That was his second career, was being the site manager there. Bill, on his deathbed, literally 3 days before he passed away, told me in graphic real-time detail the story of how Assiniboine helped 3 other Canadian destroyers shoot up some vessels trying to come out of Brest in August of 1944, shortly after D-Day, when the Germans were encircled there. He described to me in real time how it was raining, how in his gunnery director position, he couldn't see very well through the optics in the dark and the rain when the ship was vibrating. He described how when the gunfire started, he was proud of his good shooting. He told me how when the star shell burst over the Germans and he realized they were not large warships, they were vessels full of people trying to break out of the sea, out of the encirclement. He told me his first thought was, they're going to die tonight, not me. And he told me how he remembered that one of the 3 ships disappeared, and how when he got the radar repeater back at request from his CO, he realized the last German ship was fleeing down the smoke of one of the ships they'd set on fire. And Bill told me with real tears in his eyes and a quaver in his voice in the hospital here in Midland, he said, but Gordy, he said, that German captain was brilliant to think of that and what was going on. He said, but we had radar, so I got him too. Bill stopped, and then he said something to me that I used to quote when I did speeches for the RCN when I was in uniform on Remembrance Day and sometimes on Battle of the Atlantic Sunday. Bill said to me, he hated the war for it having robbed him of the carefree youth he should have had. He told me he hated it for the killing he witnessed and participated in. But then he laid his head on the pillow, and when he opened his eyes again, he looked at me with a hard squint. And what I saw then was not the gentle, sick old man that I knew, but the tough sea officer he was. And he looked at me and he said, but Gordy, nothing in my life ever matched being officer of the watch on a well-armed Canadian destroyer, doing 36 knots through the dark off the coast of France, looking for trouble. That's how he said it. And I told Hanks that story, and I showed him these things, and I showed him that picture, and he quietly thanked me, and I hope it helped him. He's probably one of the best actors in the world. He didn't really need my help, but part of my job was to help him feel those things. Thank you very much, folks. The next picture is just a slide, and I would be very interested in hearing your questions and asking what you'd like me to explain or apologize for.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Gord, for that. I'm going to stop share right now, and we'll go into our Q&A session. I've been monitoring the chat. I don't see any questions on there right now, but so I'm going to take the privilege allocated to me in organizing this and break the ice with some question. Gord, having seen the movie, there was a scene where they depict the U-boats communicating directly with Tom Hanks's character on the bridge of the destroyer over RT, radio telephone. It struck me that there might be some technical accuracy issues involved in that. And the other thing that really also struck me was the whole scene where the U-boat commander sounded like a James Bond villain, etc. Did it really add to the movie in that sense? I wonder if you'd comment on those.
Sure, Paul. That's a good example, actually, of what happens when you're making a feature film. The short answer to the first part of your question is it was utterly and absolutely and completely impossible for a U-boat to broadcast on what they call then TBS, talk between ships, what we call radio telephone now, or VHF. It was utterly impossible. U-boats did not carry radios that could speak with voice transmission. So for the radio operator in one of our U-boats in the story. To achieve that, he would have to build a microphone and a radio that could deal with a microphone. And then he would have to develop the capability to transmit and receive on duplex channels, which was a war-winning secret the Allies had then. In fact, the British and Canadians had, the Americans didn't yet. We shared it with them. Something that was developed by the Royal Air Force so fighter pilots could talk to each other. It was utterly impossible. It did happen very rarely that submarines could accidentally find one of the duplex channels and listen, but they changed those constantly, so it never did them much good. I did have a discussion with Mr. Hanks and with Aaron Schneider, our director, about how in the novel this phenomena does not occur. And I told them both that I did not think it was an accident that C.S. Forrester gave the American captain a German name, Krauss. I think he wanted the reader to see that the German officers were just as professional as our hero was and doing their best. I asked them to consider, if they'd seen Das Boot, which they had, which I think is a superb film, if they could imagine that captain so losing control of himself that he would yank an impossible microphone from his radio operator and start howling animal noises. I thought it weakened the sinister nature of the professionals they were facing, but the studio didn't agree, and we ended up with an enemy like that. You can't win them all.
Paul, how do we get involved in asking these questions?
I was just going to explain that. I'm sort of monitoring. I think the best thing would be basically if people could just sort of raise their hand, and between myself and Gord, hopefully we'll pick you all up. I did notice there is a question here. Two questions from Emily Caron. It's, what is the full name of this great bill? Question. So Emily, can you give us a bit more information on what you're asking there? Is Emily still with us?
Yes, I'm still here. Just the gentleman you got the protector, the round protector from this.
His full name was William Lanose. He retired from the service as a lieutenant commander. William Lanose. He is a descendant of Huguenots.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for that. And there is another question I just see. How much, and this is from John Azar, how much did the production crew relate to the story and the history, and what was it like to watch that process?
Good question. Most of them just come from making a superhero movie or Batman or something, or Superman, and they were going off to do similar pictures afterwards. But under Mr. Hanks' leadership, they pulled together and they cared a lot about it. And one by one, they came and told me family stories. And they told me over and over again how glad they were to have the experience of seeing recreated things they'd heard about in their childhood and so forth from relatives that had endured these things. And of course, aboard USS Kidd, in action, she was hit by a kamikaze and was a fairly dramatic loss of life on board. Under Hank's leadership, we conducted a memorial ceremony to those dead men. There was a real feeling that we had people looking over our shoulders while we were shooting this movie.
That must have given you a great sense of satisfaction, though, to watch that process.
Absolutely, it did.
And I'm going to cheat a little bit here on this, Gord, because I saw your presentation before. But I remember from your previous presentation, you had asked the audience about a question. On one of the slides is pictures of Hanks and others in combat gear right by the bridge wing, and there's silhouettes on there. And that relates to what you had just said.
Yes, the Kidd, of course, fought the Japanese, and the silhouettes and the rising sun flags commemorated her kills of aircraft and ships. So one of the things we needed to do was remove those as carefully as we could electronically. And part of my job was to watch the movie, watching for incongruous things like Cold War era electronics and Pacific War artifacts. Where we could, we removed them. Where we couldn't, such as her very heavy anti-aircraft armament, we just kept.
Okay, I'm just scanning to see if anyone's got their hand up, but okay, see Malcolm.
Yeah, I've got two questions. First was, how did they justify having the ship stop in submarine-infected waters for 15 or 20 minutes to bury the dead?
Aha! Good question, because we had that battle on board. The ship did not stop. It would have taken her 15 minutes to stop. She was probably doing 12 knots, or actually at that point we had her doing 22, coming back to the convoy. When you say stop engines, the ship does not stop.
Well, I recognize that, but
Yeah.
it seems incongruous that they'd even try
They did.
with submarines out there.
That's realistic. And of course, as you see, the ceremony is interrupted by action resuming.
The other question I've got is I've got a copy here of the Cruel Sea. Did anybody use that as a basis for this movie?
I did.
Good. Because that is real stuff, real ships in real situations with real equipment on board, by the way.
I'm glad you brought that up, Malcolm. There's a scene in the Cruel Sea in the film, actually the film of it, where Lieutenant Farabee is on the stern at his depth charge station, and there's a flash from a ship exploding. The look of terror in that young actor's face is perfect. And I described that to my colleagues. And I think the nearest we came to that in our show, in our film, was a scene we shot where Hanks realizes in trying to stop to pick up 2 or 3 men, he's let 45 more burn and he's watching them burn to death. And in the novel, Forrester took quite a bit of space describing the conflicting emotions and the horror. He's realizing he's failed and he's failed again, and he's not being a good captain, but he's got to keep going. And imagine this: we're on our set in the soundstage. The bridge of the ship is as fake could be, with screens and literally about 80 people standing around watching the actors perform. I had a kid with a stick saying "burning tanker" on it to give Hanks the right azimuth to look on. I used a little cardboard compass that I made to use to show bearings. I held it under the actor's chin and said, "That's where you look." And Hanks, we had a red light flashing in his face. How artificial can that be to simulate the flames? And he looked at the flames, he closed his eyes, and then he turned back to the bridge and started giving his orders again. And I knew what he was feeling. And Captain Tim O'Leary, who was one of my last COs in the service, wrote to me afterwards. He noticed that, and he said he honored Hanks for catching that loneliness of being in command, knowing that you're not right all the time, but you got to act like you are, and you got to keep going. I guess I wandered a bit from your original question, but yes, I did have a copy of The Cruel Sea, and I did look at the film, which I thought they did.
I've got another question, but I'll leave other people to ask theirs first.
Yeah,
Okay.
Pierre, I think you had your hand up, did you?
I was in Great Lakes training in the late 50s, and the Rush Bagot Treaty came up as a problem for us.
Yes.
We were in Algerines at the time, and we used to pick up reserve sailors, as you know, for 2 weeks training all through the Great Lakes system and bring them back again. And
Right.
wondering if that came into effect in your program at all you put together.
Well,
Because they had Great Lakes training on the other side, and the American side, which is much more powerful than ours was actually at the time. We wrote a
Yeah. Well, we did carry weapons aboard HMSB. She had a brass 3-pounder midships, 2 1-pounder swivel guns, and the Marines had their weapons. But for some reason, nobody ever paid attention to us, except once when we were coming into a port, and I had a flintlock pistol on its belt clip, and a police boat came shooting up to us. They were Canadians, and I looked around the deck and I realized I don't have permission to carry this pistol. And even though she's a flintlock, Bill C-68 treats it like a Browning semi-automatic. So we quickly threw all our weapons in various lockers. I sat my 10-year-old son on the locker where the pistols were, and the police came aboard, and it turned out all they wanted to do was talk to us. So I think that was a close call, but otherwise it wasn't a problem.
Thank you very much.
Roger, did you have your hand up? Roger Litwell? No? Okay. I'm just scanning the screens of people who have video. I don't see anyone with the hands up.
I've got another quick one, if you don't mind.
Sure, Malcolm, I was going to come back to you.
One of the things, my background is venture, and then flying and Bonaventure and et cetera, and been to sea
Excellent.
Well, that's during the middle of the Atlantic during the winter. Is it realistic to show torpedo wakes in sea states like they were portraying there?
Good for you, Malcolm. Good for you. We had battles about that in early pre-production. The production was assuming at first that the torpedoes ran on the surface so you could see them. And I was able to successfully, with all the diplomacy and knowledge I could muster, to describe that a surface runner was virtually harmless. And the torpedo they saw in Dunkirk, it looked like a surface runner. Well, that's a defective torpedo. And so then they wanted me to study what kind of torpedoes the Germans had. So I realized quickly that by 41, they were using mostly electric. They'd almost completely converted. There's no wake. And I remember Aaron, the director, looked up at me from my report and said, well, how do you see them coming? And I said, Aaron, when you fire a torpedo at somebody, you want to hurt them. You don't want them to see it coming. Well, that was a dramatic problem for the film. So we dug and dug, and I was able to find reports that by 42, when they were using more torpedoes, they got ahead of production and they brought old compressed air torpedoes back. And so we assumed that's what our submarines were using. So we had wakes again.
Okay.
But there were battles about that. So with our near miss story, when they were dodging, I took that out of a real story of a British destroyer, where he had 2 torpedoes coming, one following him from astern, and he had to wait for it to pass him so he could go hard over to comb the second one. That really happened. And I don't have the book in front of me here right now, but he described putting his hands on the rail of the bridge and twisting as hard as he could, trying to help the destroyer turn, but the second one missed. And when we were discussing the animation of that, I described that we could let that torpedo hit and glance off if it's at such a shallow angle. And we discussed at one point having it come up out of the water with its prop spinning. I described, imagine like a 1,000 cc motorcycle with no muffler going at 12,000 RPM. That's what it would sound like. But at that point, we were worrying about costs, so we let it stay underwater. So
can I just briefly say one thing? Master and Commander, I'm kind of a stickler for detail. Master and Commander is the best movie I've ever seen with respect to all of the minute detail of the characters, the ship, and I've been on the ship in San Diego, and also the dialogue. It's just been fantastic.
Thank you. I worked very hard on that, and so did a lot of other people. Thank you very much.
Anybody else? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Gord, John Larson here. It's good to see you again, my friend.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Great to see you.
Otherwise known as 702-458.
I go incognito these days. I'm out of the service. My hair is long and I'm incognito. But listen, here's my question for you. What's your litmus test when you're doing these movies? You invest years, hundreds of hours. When it's ultimately out, what is your litmus test, Gord, that you've done your job well? Is it that it can be used in an, I don't know, an educational setting at a school? What is it for you personally?
That's a very good question. For me personally, and I do have 2 tests. One is, does it feel respectful? And if it feels respectful, and I've worked on some that aren't, but if it feels respectful, I think we've done a good job. Even if some of the details, even like in Master and Commander, there's lots that wasn't completely accurate. But if it feels respectful to the suffering and courage of the people we're depicting, that's one test. The other is, do I think it's going to inspire people to crack books? And those are the 2 things I keep in mind. I do also have to remember that when I give my advice, it's now theirs and they can do with it whatever they like. I see my job as showing where the course is. So when the picture diverts port and starboard of the course, they know when and by how much. And I don't generally fight, but I will debate if I think the credibility or the respect that the production is showing will be harmed.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you.
I'm glad to hear that at least one member of the USN will hopefully crack the book as a result of your efforts too. So, and I'm just scanning through. Anyone else? Oh, there's a question. There we go. Ivo, you're muted.
Sorry.
Hello.
My question was a detail. Hello. In the movie, it seems to me that Hanks is doing a hell of a lot of running around outside the bridge and so on.
Good
Was
for
that
you.
an issue for you? Like, that seemed pretty unrealistic to me.
Well, that's a good point. And Hanks remarked to me, he said, I've always got people in my way. You see, he shoves people aside sometimes.
Right.
And I said, well, Tom, I said, that is why. I said, here's why. Your destroyer was designed before the war. Nobody really thought before the war that the major occupation of destroyers was submarine hunting. They were designed to be able to keep up with battleships and deliver torpedo attacks and screen battleships from torpedo attacks. That's why they've got such large turning circles. That's why this ship has an enclosed bridge. It's to keep you from the elements while you're doing 36 knots through giant waves. However, if you're inside, you can't see what's going on. So he was constantly dashing back and forth to the bridge wings. I said, that's why when your Navy developed what they called destroyer escorts, what we called frigates, the bridges were open. You could see what was going on, and they sacrificed comfort for the ability to see what was going on. I also described to him that in modern warships, at action stations, the captains down in the what we call the op center, they call the CIC, because instrument sensing has surpassed what you can see with your eyeballs. But in World War II, it was eyeballs, and yes, it was a problem to have to dash from one side to the other all the time. Good for you for noticing that.
And Jerry, being the techno god you are, I see that you're using the electronic hands up symbol. So if anyone else wants to use that, please go ahead. It makes my job easier. So off you go, Jerry.
Good to see you, Gordon.
Yo ho.
Hey, hanging out with all those Americans and speaking about cracking a book, what was the reaction when they realized that, gee, Canada was in the war 3 or 4 years before the Americans won, and we were doing pretty well. And because the Canadian Navy, Canadian forces during the Second World War often get subsumed amongst the Brits,
yep,
or overshadowed by what the Americans believe their contribution was, which was pretty minimal in the Atlantic when you consider what happened after Hawaii.
Well, Jerry, I would say all of them were very surprised from top to bottom, very surprised. And they were actually sorry and delighted to learn the truth. Hanks told me we don't teach our history well enough. When we were just, I think this is germane to what you just asked me. One of the assignments I got was to write one paragraph about the character of each of the navies that we showed in the picture of each of the Allied navies. For the British, I described a service with such a long history of success, centuries, that their foes often believed in it as well as they did. For the Canada, I described a tiny service growing to become a giant, fully aware that every day they were creating traditions for the future, and I wrote about that we all here understand. For the Americans, I described an immensely powerful service, completely inexperienced and untried. That's what I wrote for that. For the Poles, I didn't know what to write, but I remembered in Charles Lamb's book on the Corvette Navy, describing hearing a Polish officer in some sort of meeting. And I'll have to clean his language up a bit, but imagine a thick Polish accent. And he said, enough of this lovemaking, let's get fricking. There, I slurred the word. I described to Hanks that the Poles were completely unresponsive and impatient with tactics that didn't directly go at the Germans. And that's what this officer was expressing his frustration at. And when I told that line to Tom, he just smiled and said, I know some Poles, I understand. So the Americans, I think their nation is large enough that intelligent, well-educated people can go through whole lifetimes and never look outside the empire. But when they do, they're generally delighted and bemused, I'll say. And it was not uncommon while we were shooting this movie to have people while we're eating and so forth come and say, hey, Gord, can I join you? And ask me questions, which of course for a historian, that's just what you want to have happen. So they didn't know much. They were eager to learn. How's that for an answer?
Yeah, and certainly the Gord with the Poles, the similar feeling was with the Polish air squadrons in the Battle of Britain.
Yes.
Well, I was in England for 4 years at NATO Maritime Headquarters there near Norfolk, where the Polish were based. And the movie Battle of Britain does somewhat describe that. The Poles were
Yes.
especially effective because they had blood in their eyes for the Germans, and they were willing to close and kill.
I told some of my colleagues about a Polish farmer we have here who was born in Poland. He's Canadian now, of course, but he likes German Shepherds. He always names them after German generals. He's got a Guderian right now. He had a Rommel before. And I said, Joe, why do you name them after German generals? He said, because I like to look at my dog and say, Rommel, sit.
Yeah, I'm not sure that would work so far as having to clean up after the dog, though.
No.
So I'm just scanning along, and anyone else want to join in, please do. I mean, I've got the extra Zoom account here, so I can go on as long as people want to. And Ed Falstream, by the way, yeah, I noticed that the sun is over the yardarm because you had a glass in your hand a little moment ago.
It's over the yardarm here in Winnipeg too, and I'm afraid I've got to go. But this has been absolutely magnificent. Thank you very much, Gordon, for your wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you for your very good questions. That's always the best part for me.
I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Anyone else can jump in as they wish. I don't see any hands up, and I'm going once. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, it's Roger.
Hi, Roger.
Hi, Gordon. Just a comment. I recognize the U-210 battle sequence in the movie as it was transpiring, and it just brought a huge smile to my face when I was watching it. But I just received a photo collection that I had just scanned from a sailor in the RCN, and I was shocked to find a picture of Max Bernays as a young, able seaman on board Metapedia. Years before, and you know, he became famous for his action as coxswain in Assiniboine. And you know, it's just amazing what we can find out there that's sitting around collecting dust and goes to tell these stories. And to see these stories depicted on the big film and Canada playing the role in the movie that she actually did during the time is phenomenal. And the nod to Shawinigan and Sackville being scanned, as well as Haida, you know, absolute kudos. Real cute kudos for what you did.
Well,
Thanks,
I was
Gordon.
part of the team, but thanks a lot, Roger.
Yeah.
That's an
And thank you.
important point.
That means a lot to me. Thank you.
Robert Lucas.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Quick question. Will it be possible to get a copy of the recording of this session?
I will do my utmost. I'm hoping that I have been recording it. As far as I'm aware, it's telling me it is. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to get that, and then we'll have to sort out a way that I can get it onto a YouTube channel. And once that's done, then we should be able to. I should be able to dist it out to anyone who wants to see it. And Scott Osborne, you might actually help me on that regard, because I know you've had some experience on that.
Yeah, we can help you with that. We've all our presentations that we've done through webinar at RUSI, as you know, we've recorded them and we post them to our website. Our intention is to get your recording and post it to our website, which is done through youtube.ca as well. So it's there for anybody to view at any time they want, and I would presume they can make copies of it directly. So,
oh, great.
So we can certainly help you with that, no problem.
Well, that's fantastic. And like I said, I'm just hoping that that the technology is smiling on us for that.
Thanks very much, Paul and Scott.
Yeah. And I further to the discussion we just had before, a little before that, I was hoping that Peter Chance would be able to tune in on this. Peter, as you know, just turned 100 last November. Battle of Atlantic veteran. And so I will definitely look to see if we can make this available to Peter to watch, because I think he'd be interested. It would sure be nice to have had him here to have the perspective of somebody who was there. But I have to say, Gord, I think you've done a fantastic job in bringing everybody and the whole audience to this movie as close to being there as they can, and also to ensuring, as people have noted, that Canada's contribution is at least portrayed with accuracy. And even if it's a cameo, at least we're there doing our job as we were during the Second World War.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, I always remember the movie The Longest Day, and there's one mention of Canadians there. One mention. I mean, yeah, and it's sort of a side. It's the British, and the Canadians. Yeah, so I had our own beach, but anyhow.
So Paul, if I can say a final word, I want to say, especially to Gordon, as a history teacher, I fully understood what he was doing and totally respected and understand it. Thank you. And Paul, to you, thank you so much for putting this together. We had, almost 8, how many people at the end of the day? 70?
We touched 52.
52, and from right across Canada, which is just excellent. So and America as well. So job well done, and I think this is a great afternoon.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks very much, Bill. Like I said, I'm happy to stay and leave this going as long as people have questions. And Scott, you've got one right there.
Sorry. No, I don't. I was just giving a thumbs up. There's a little reactions button at the bottom, and you can click little emojis and fling them up on your screen is what I did. So thumbs up for the whole thing.
That's my fault. I've got to bone up on my emoji identification qualifications.
No problem. Understood. Thanks.
Okay, guys. Well, I think we've had a pretty good run, so to speak. And thank you. I'll take the opportunity again to thank everyone who participated. And I hope it was an enjoyable and instructive and illuminating few hours. And especially thank you, Gord, for you taking the time and giving us a real good sense of the value of folks like you in producing good wartime movies, but also good history. And as we had a discussion, Gordon and I have had a discussion before, and there's so many examples of absolutely horrendous movies, that they should issue airsick bags with when you watch them if you've got any historic sense. And Gord, you've avoided that issue on this and so many of your projects. So thanks again for what you've done. And like I said, when you're out this way, the Union Club will have a bar tab running for you.
Well,
so with that, I'd like to say thank you again, and hopefully we'll see each other again and some other opportunity on Zoom, and hopefully even one day in person. Who knows? Thanks again, guys.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.